I'm going to quickly record this before it goes out of my mind. So I want to elaborate on some things that I ended on, which I think need at least some slight revision. In as far as that, I implied that there was no sort of active input of or output of Fe from Ti. There is an active output of Fe from Ti. And I was kind of caught up in the metaphysical, sort of philosophical sort of issue that that is ultimately sort of meaningless. It's not meaningless. It's ultimately redundant, but that redundancy only becomes manifest in terms of Fi's interpolation of the manifestation of that Fe that is signaled by the Ti. So there's an indirect impingement on Fi by Ti's correspondence with Fe. And this sort of goes into a broader point, which is very convoluted, which is that, and this is also worth bringing up for its own sake, is that the initial sort of foundation of this entire model of the mind, which is that Fe is the basic reduction of everything, and that Fi is the direct precipitate from that Fe, because Fi is in that prime position of being the first filter. It can lay claim to a special kind of dominance over Fi. So I've sort of been following through with this sort of rationale that it's very important that the introverted function precedes the extroverted function, so that there's a natural hierarchy at work, where just right at the start that is not followed. And I want to say that yes, it's true that it sort of is not followed, but because it's not followed right at the start at that pole position, that in some functional sense you can Fi can construe an argument that it is being followed, that the Fi does precede the Fe. And this is where you get almost the contest between ontology and epistemology. And so there is a sort of, there's a fundamental, there are two fundamental flows going on here. This has a similarity with the alchemical features and properties of the magnetic fluid and the electric fluid, basically. But there's so many other different, ways of sort of creating other systems, and I was going to go into some of those, and there's no point in going into alchemy though, because alchemy, I mean, maybe there's something to it, but you really have to be in those people's shoes that were developing those systems and seeing how they sort of hang together with their other systems. Because well, I was going to make this general claim, is that the thing that makes this whole subject so complex is that there is a fundamental nebulousness which on some level cannot be overcome. That's not really how I wanted to phrase that point, but I want to get into that issue as well. But so because of these relays and these asymmetries and things like that, it is fundamentally mysterious, and this is why and the real point is to find a point of real understanding through the mystery, which does take some concerted effort. It's not easy to do, because you cannot merely apply a formulaic approach to it. there are things that have to be engaged in simultaneously, and there are attitudes that have to sort of be simultaneously contended on different fronts. Um, I do think that this also generally relates to the sort of the idea that the real work in philosophy is something of a kind of integrated psychology, a metaphysics within psychology, and sort of I think that's the general notion of Stoicism. But anyway, is that there has to be some sense of discipline um, in order to sort of make any real headway. Anyway, yeah, I just touched on a whole lot of things. Okay, let me just go back a second. So, and this, I don't know if I should talk about the. So, in some sense, how Fi does this is that it regards itself as the generative property. It is the seed. Symbolically, Fi, I think, is the seed. Um, it can sort of grow and adapt to its conditions. But packed within it, it has, sort of a kind of sufficiency, um, that it knows what it sort of it has an internal schema of its own development, for its own development, which is okay. Okay, let me just complete some of these trains of thoughts. So, I mean, I wanted to make a general sort of philosophical case how that there, at least therefore, is a reverberation between Ti and Fi in the sense through the shared conduit of Fe, and therefore Fe is that is its uh, that is the point of it. So it is housing that sort of that Fi communication. Uh, and so it's sort of the indirect medium of these more spiritual and abstract properties, and without that medium, it would have uh, no lines within which those substances could be housed. Um, uh, I used to say this in some of my other recordings, but the reason why flesh will not inherit the kingdom is because the kingdom is made out of it, um, is made from it. Uh, Let me think now what the other things that I've left lagging. So that was and so okay, yeah. So I did just want to talk about the general kinds of systems that can be constructed from this. Now, the problem is that they don't have a pervasive um, relevance. If you take these things and you order them into different systems, and there are different ways of ordering them into different systems, you can glean some insight, but that you will always have to rely on multiple of these systems. They will not be standalone. They will be very sort of dry and abstract and one-dimensional in their in what they describe, and so you have to have recourse to more than one of them to sort of triangulate anything, and all of that is generally highly conditional on sort of abstractly keeping some things constant and such. Um, and they're bound within very particular contexts. One of the more interesting ones of these, and it's always interesting also to take these systems and compare them with what I would consider to be their primordial source, which is the 17, and sort of contrasting them with the orders in which they appear differently in different systems. Let me describe one of these systems. So, for example, one of these systems, which I have drawn out, which is something like, I believe, the Egyptians had a system of 12 chakras, and I believe that those 12 chakras can generally, which is also described as sort of three serpents that are coiled up the spine. So they're three separate circuits in this chakra system, which I've always correlated that with the Hindu gunas. And so you can take a collection of these things and you can sort of group them together. So, for example, the Rajas one um, uh, would and I don't know how to describe this now, but I'll just use two. So I'll use the one name slogan, and then I'll use the human definition. So would start with liberty, which is why it is, which is generally regarded, and I'm giving them in the alchemical order. I'm not giving them actually from the bottom to top, which is slightly untraditional. So why it is the earth of Rajas. So it's very sort of almost reason focused in terms of the liberty that one is pursuing. Then the next one, which is the fire component, which would be what will be, which I've already named and spoken about in the earlier recording, is instinct. And then the third one is what should be, which is trust, TE. And the fourth one is why it would be, which is what would I call that? Damn, I don't have these documents open. Let me just think for a second. Why it would is faith. Yeah. So. All right, and so what should be, which is trust, is the water element, and why it would be, faith, is the air element. And then the interesting thing is the air element encapsulates the whole other guna in some sense, or it is something like the composition of that air element becomes a whole other world in some sense. And so why it would be, when that atmosphere is dispersed and or sort of invalidated or displaced or substituted for, you get the ground of the next guna, which is sattva, and the earth of sattva is I should really just be looking at my things rather than trying to remember this. is how it is, which is I've also called tranquility, and the fire of sattva is no, I think I've said the wrong thing. The earth of sattva is what it is. Which is exuberance. And the one name slogan is exuberance, and the fire of sattva is how it will be, which is prudence, and the water of sattva is why it should be, which is eminence, my name for that, which is corresponded with the salt. I'm just pointing that out because the other ones I did actually mention, but if someone is keeping track of those sort of meticulous details, and the air of sattva is what would be, which is moderation. And then the displacement of what would be is the realm of tamas, which is in some sense the most cerebral, in fact, which kind of breaks the simplistic stereotype, at least peddled by lots of Hinduistic interpretation. But the earth of tamas is how it is, which I've called tranquility. The fire of tamas is why it will be, which is hope. The water of tamas is I've made a mistake. It's what should be, which is trust. And the air of tamas is how it ought to be, which is how it would be, which is appraisal. Which means that my error right at the start with rajas, it should have been liberty instinct, and faith is the last one. Come on, it's not that complicated. Liberty instinct. Which means that one must be how it should be, which is placidity, which is somewhat enigmatic because it's not actually a real word. I sort of created that word out of a weird sort of. It sounds like it could be a word rather. What I, because it sort of has the connotation that it's placid, but that perhaps it's also malleable, um, that it's sort of pliable, and that's what I was trying to get across with placidity. Um, it is because that does correspond with the second dimension. Fi. Anyway, and then what's interesting is that then the air of tamas, how it ought to be, is then displaced by rajas. Um, the earth, and then starts again, and the earth of rajas being liberty, why it is. Anyway, that nice complete system, right, is you can get a lot of work out of that, especially out of that particular order. Um, you can draw some metaphysical things from that, and then you can get even more from that when you sort of contrast it against where these elements, actually sort of are situated from the order of the 17 themselves, and then you can sort of map onto that, sort of human drama and incongruity and whatever. You can map onto that sort of common themes of dissonance between conflicting, sort of parties and ways of thinking and such. Um, what's my point? So the reason why I wanted to just describe a model like that is that it is actually required to go through. You do actually have to create things like that to start to get a handle on these things, to start to sort of discern the spirits, as it were, to start getting a reading of these things, to develop a discerning spirit. To see the propensity inherent within things and such and such. But I just want to make 2 points around this. Um, uh, so the 2 points would be something like what is the point? The point is that the reason why it is necessary is because there are validly multiple narratives occurring, and until one gets practice of following those threads in various combination, or at various points of intersection, and interpenetration, it's not really um, it's not really viable, or you're not going to be able to produce a viable understanding that isn't just going to sort of be um, collapsed and sort of and some new stochastic regurgitation sort of just endlessly erupts out of the last one. Um, Essentially because of trying to cling to something so structured or solid, so as to in fact be, in terms of the actual complexity of the issues involved, to be such a brittle sort of attachment that is going to force this, sort of daisy chain of inviable uh, and, and sort of failures of voidness or something like that, which will generally, sadly, often just be recast or reframed as a kind of strange narrative that has its own journey, which even um, could be characterized as sort of being a lost spirit or something like that, or a lost seeker. But so the kind of arduousness, which is often described in the scriptures as the meek, the humble, the poor, um, which is really quite a rare feature. People are actually not very often meek or poor in the metaphorical sense that it is actually being um, uh, in the metaphorical sense that it's being illustrated. That is being illustrated. Okay, so yeah, so the another way of capturing some of these issues is that in Revelations, what is described in terms of the seven heads of the beast, with it with their 10 horns, um, you have these layers of complexity, which are actually, you know, uh, they're not clearly laid out because they cannot be clearly, um, and it talks about a beast with 3 heads, and then it talks about one of the heads is sort of badly damaged at some point. So at some point, you have to be capable of taking out a whole segment of erroneous thinking to create the space and the clarity of, actually erecting an understanding. And that's not going to um, uh, happen if you can't even, sort of track the horns. And so, you have to have a reading on that. Oh well, there's a beast with 7 heads, but they also have 10 horns, and you know these require separate systems of evaluation, um, or at least, yeah, as I tried to describe it earlier, that there is more than one front uh, in the battle to regain one's sanity. um, to regain the thread of self-determinism and self-actualization. So, what was my point? Is that there are realms and features which are part of the whole issue, which are within their various subsets of issues are functionally independent from one another, and they're independent in some ways, and they are interrelated in other ways, and those accounts of that interrelatedness and those independences are yet held by other um, ambits of purview and perspective and framing, right? Um, so yeah, there is a necessity to sort of be robust enough to confront oneself with the hodgepodge and sort of and to start gain a sense of discerning as to which hodgepodges are insoluble or toxic, in the sense that they are uh, they bring one no closer. Um, but even that exercise itself, to know that that particular avenue does not, has a particular character to it. It's not just even that it leads nowhere, but why it leads nowhere. Why it is that that will lead nowhere. Um, you know, I think there's a metaphor that actually applies to this, is that it does somewhat, it does take 1,000 years. Which I don't, that's as a spiritual metaphor, it has nothing to do with time, although it does actually take also a great deal of time, but it takes a great deal of experience more so than time. And experience is not something that I think can correlate with the conception of minutes and hours and days and years. Um, and the ability to record experience, therefore, to accumulate that bank of 1,000 years, metaphorically, um, of searchable data, of a repository of computational blood that has been devoted towards the search. Anyway, and then obviously I think that there is a sense in which that can also be communicated and shared, um, where that process is accelerated by what famously is described as breaking of the bread, which is really a way of describing the breaking down of an understanding, the breaking down of somebody else's understanding. The fleshly thinking is the loaf of bread which is being um, broken. The flesh is being broken and consumed in the communion. and I don't know if this doesn't necessarily relate, but because I haven't actually spoken about the blood yet, but um, blood is I think people get this completely backwards, especially when they've got their weird ideas of vicarious redemption. That the blood of the communion is not this vicarious redeemer. The blood of the communion is the blood of the members of the communion, which in particular, those members in particular, are the body of Christ. It's not some sort of um, I don't know, what is it, transubstantiation, or what do they call it? It's really ridiculous. It, it's a ritual. It's a symbolic, somewhat contract, But what is actually occurring is the blood. Uh, the blood provided by the members in the communion. Um, it's a strange sort of. I'm just trying to think of a good way to summarize it, but this is somewhat changing the topic, perhaps. And it would probably be better if I spoke about the sixth dimension first. I guess I can't help myself. I'll just go into this will all probably be revised in sort of much more, well, in the weird, strange details that I usually go into when I get back to doing this in order. But basically, it's interesting because the real blood within people is a good metaphor for consciousness. You know, in some sense, if your intellect was going to be and even in psychiatry they know this, you can look, if you look in a very, very detailed way and you look at the components of someone's blood, you can get a very good reading on their brain chemistry. It's sort of uh, the blood is a reservoir of what is still lingering, the kind of the endocrine signals that are still remnant. So your recent history, that your consciousness is actually in the process of digesting, or that is there to be digested or to be considered. Um, so sort of, if you could sort of break down your conscious vision of reality into its various elements, all of those elements could have a material um, correlation to some component of the blood. And so the energy that you even have in order to think is in the medium of the blood. So it's like, in some sense, it doesn't really matter if one of your organs, um, even one of your major organs, is having a huge issue. It's only when that issue is transmitted into the blood that it actually sort of um, has a kind of systemic impact on one's cognition, apart from, I guess, the nerve stuff. But the nerve stuff will also have a kind of sympathetic correlation in the circulatory system. So yeah, that's perhaps a far-reaching illustration about an organ failure. I guess I didn't have to make such a stark illustration to actually make the point, and that perhaps is a bit too unconvincing. But I always thought it was interesting as an artistic choice that in at least one of the more recent remakes of RoboCop, which is effectively just a brain uh, cyborg sort of interface, they didn't just save the brain, they actually at least had an artificial circulation system that included the lungs, that the lungs and the brain were somewhat preserved within that incarnation of RoboCop. And I thought that was very interesting. That I do think that there's an intrinsic thing there that without the lungs, there is really no way to visualize uh, the circulatory sustenance that the brain is actually being is imbued with life. Anyway, so I just thought I'd mention that in passing. But again, I think the biggest way of understanding it is that not only is the circulation, the blood, a repository of the things that you're lined up to consider in terms of that you're lined up to think about, but it is also the record, almost a fairly short-term memory of the things that you have been thinking about. In that it is the soup and the medium of the residue from one's mental journeys and such, that there, if there is a correlation, it's not just, let's say, in the structure of the brain itself. That structure will almost have a much more vibrant correlation to a profile uh, in the blood. So in some sense, I believe that there's a better argument to be made that the circulation system is like the switchboard more so than the nerves are. And the composition of the blood is a collective enterprise of the organs in some sense. And so it is the field in which there's a combination of synergistic or disintegrated functions that are occurring. And so there's a real sense in which there is an internal communion occurring to some extent, and the health of that and the precipitate of that, um, and the field in which that is sort of I've, I've done a far better job of describing these things. But anyway, There are probably slightly better metaphors and such, but that's enough of the concept that one can probably make a neater point than that. So the real difference is in some sense as well. Then when does your blood begin, and where does your organs be? Your responsibility for your own blood begin and end, in some sense. And the sort of the distinction between exterior and interior. Um, and in some sense, what the communion is a metaphysical extension of that, in terms of having a shared spiritual bank of experience repository. And this comes out most clearly in dreams. So people will have dreams for one another. Their gift of prophecy, um, will sort of because generally one's own capability of um, which has to do with the how it is, uh, which is also called tranquility. To some extent, usually that's somewhat integrated within someone's own life, but that reading is usually especially capable of applying to others. And so it's a very powerful gift to share with other people. And so, because it can do a lot more to others, for others. Um, in some sense, it would be like there are many different methods to breaking of bread. Um, and so, as you might sit down at a table with different people that break the bread differently. Uh, anyway, okay, this is going off into La La Land a bit too much, but yeah, I guess that's probably enough to speak about.